the other place, and everyone I've run into has had nothing but the highest praise for Joanne, and I think in a moment we'll find out why. But she's the CEO and founder of Our Innovation Group, and also the author of a book that just barely came out, which I highly suggest you look into, called Pivot, published by Wiley. And also, way back when at Nortel, she ran the Business Ventures Group, and actually had a number of spin-outs and spin-ins, one that was acquired by eBay and PayPal for upwards of nearly about $1 billion. So she's someone who really knows how to do both radical, disruptive, as well as, to some extent, the incremental stuff. But I think that's not necessarily going to be our focus today. But nonetheless, Joanne, thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate it. Look forward to your talk.
Okay, thanks, Kelvin. So I'm delighted to be here, and thanks for all of you who are here in the room and many of you who are on the WebEx. I understand we have quite a few there. I guess we're living in a global world now, and so actually seeing people is always not part of the reality anymore. So we'll call it virtual reality, which we studied a number of years ago. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk about innovation from our perspective, and we've had years of research that have gone into it, but we've also had a lot of very much practical experience, and I'll talk a little bit about my own experience, which sort of paved the way for how we've come to think about innovation today. So what we're going to do is we'll talk a little bit about our journey to becoming the company that we are. We'll also talk about the importance of a common language and a mindset. Innovation is obviously a discipline, as we see it, that is still maturing. It's not completely mature like you would see marketing or finance or manufacturing or engineering, but it's coming. And one of the most important parts of a discipline is having that common language and mindset. We will also talk about culture and collaboration, because culture and collaboration are a very important part of the mindset that goes along with experimentation that is critical to making innovation successful. And then finally, we'll talk about the building blocks or the roadmap that we've put together to help to make it happen. Our focus from a company point of view is less on the what, much more on the how-to. We know that innovation is difficult. We know it's not easy to make happen in companies, and that's why we've spent a part of close to 20 years now dedicating ourselves to figuring out how to make it happen. So the journey. Obviously, on a journey, there are many connection points along the way, and let me just talk about a few of mine. A few of you, I think, have heard that I was at Nortel. Before that, I was actually at Bell Canada, so I am Canadian, so if you haven't figured that out by now, by my accent, because I have my abouts that everybody figures it out from. I started many, many years ago looking at new business opportunities. It's been my passion to figure out how to create new businesses, both within the corporation and also through the startup world, because I've also worked with some startups throughout my career. And when I first came to Bell, I was actually asked to write a marketing plan. Nobody even knew what marketing was. That was back in 1982. And I think about innovation pretty much the same today. A lot of people still don't really know what innovation is all about. It's a great word. It's thrown around a lot. But what does it really mean? And that's one of the areas that we'll cover. Now, at Bell, when I was at Bell, I happened to be part of the Bell Corps, the RBOC at the time, the Regional Bell Operating Companies, the Bell Corps organization, and represented Canada. And I happened to be at one of these meetings where a guy by the name of Nick Ciancio from Pac Bell came forward and said, I've discovered this company that's going to revolutionize the internet. And the company was Netscape. So we all got excited at our meeting. And, Nick said, you got to bring it home. So I ran back to Canada. I made a presentation to our board of directors at the time, and I said, this internet thing is coming, and we got to do something about it, and Netscape is really important. And this is the answer I got. The only thing that the internet could possibly do to our long-distance business would maybe to displace some international toll traffic. So think about it. Look at where we are today and what's happened to the telcos in the process of all of this. Now, needless to say, we did form a Simpatico, which was the internet service provider. But at the time, think about what would happen to companies if they could have found a way to make it fit when you had a long-distance organization and a data organization. And many of these new business creation opportunities don't easily fit in what we're doing today, but they are the future for tomorrow. So that's sort of my Bell Canada sort of internet type story. So then let's go forward to Nortel. I spent some time, obviously, at Bell Canada, figuring out what we needed to do for new business opportunities. I realized that we needed not only a team of people investigating them, we also needed some money to fund them. So when I went to Nortel, I took on the leadership of the internal venturing program, and we started from scratch. I was hired in, had to build the team. We created a portfolio of close to 200 people in the portfolio over time. We valued it based on the valuation techniques that were being used at that time. It was worth about $200 million or so. And so we created a lot of value. But in the process of doing so, what happened is there were a number of other factors that were going on at the same time. One was Clay Christensen wrote his book, Innovator's Dilemma, and he said that big companies cannot do startups inside, and you have to spin everything out. And so during the 1996 through to 2000 time frame, that's what we were all doing. Lucent and others, we were all spinning out our value, our future value. Another thing happened to Nortel. Nortel in 1996 was not in the internet business. It was a switch provider, boxes, PBXs, all of those kinds of things. At about the 97, 98 time frame, Nortel did a right angle turn, as they called it, from a strategy point of view, and decided to obviously move into the internet, but buy its way into the internet through major M&A activities, so mergers and acquisitions. They tried to emulate the Cisco model. And the Cisco model was very good for Cisco. And obviously, Cisco is an extremely successful company to this day. But what was Nortel good at? Nortel was good at R&D. R&D was our heritage. And we completely destroyed our R&D capability in the process of this era of time. And so, obviously, Nortel, as many of you know, is no longer around today. And since a few of you are from Nortel, I don't want to get into too many details, but I did have a conversation with John Roth at the time when I was leading this group, and I said, we can't just do acquisitions. We have to also do internal venturing. We have to do organic activity. We have to work with universities. We have to build value from many different ways. And clearly, we didn't see eye to eye. I left Nortel in 2000, moved on. John Roth, well, I guess the rest is history as it pertains to that. In the process, the internal venturing program, we played out our investments, and as Calvin mentioned, we actually did have one investment that we spun out and was very successful, which is Bill Me Later. But we really did not have the opportunity to capture the true value of our internal venturing program. So that set me on the course where we can, as large companies, do this inside. I knew we could make it happen. And that's what put me into this new group called the R Innovation Group. At the time I was at Nortel, RPI was studying a number of things. One was looking at projects. How do radical or breakthrough innovation projects, how do they become successful? And they studied our project called NetActive at the time, and they also studied how we organized and structured for innovation. And through that, the first book came out called Radical Innovation. Then I joined the company, headed up the consulting part. Then they started to say, it's not good enough to just give tools and processes to projects. We have to figure out how to build a capability for breakthrough innovation. And so that was the second phase of the study, and then the second book came out called Grabbing Lightning. And so on the basis of Radical Innovation book, on the basis of the breakthrough, Grabbing Lightning Breakthrough Innovation Capability book, that's how we've really built our model for innovation. Now, as Calvin mentioned, we have a new book out called Pivot. And Pivot is really the how-to book, taking what we did from the research point of view and what we learned in practice and put it together in a book for how to go about doing all of this. So these are the intersection points that brought this together. And as a company, what we really focus on is the how-to, as I mentioned earlier. And we really partner from a collaboration point of view. And I was just speaking with Rich Duncombe, who used to lead a similar group at HP about 2 or 3 weeks ago. And what's important here is this is not easy. And a lot of companies try to make it easy. And if you live it and breathe it every single day, you know that there's a lot more to it than just generating ideas. And so what we're really focusing on is how do we get those ideas and move them through to commercialization successfully. So let's talk a a little bit now about the common language and the mindset. First, I'd like to share with you this. We actually hired Tom Fishburne, who does a lot of cartoons on the internet or elsewhere about basically, criticizing or making fun of what goes on in corporate culture. This one was one that we sort of came up with. And we see this all the time. How many times do you see a CEO say, I want innovation, and I want it everywhere? You have to be careful what you ask for. And this is what this is really all about, is that, sure, you can have it everywhere, but do you really want it in your manufacturing process? You might want some incremental improvements there, but do you really want to start getting really strategic or disruptive or radical or breakthrough when you're dealing with manufacturing? So that is really this issue of what does innovation really mean to us. Now, I know from discussions with Calvin and Mary that you've done a really good job of defining what innovation means to EMC. Now, you have the ideation plus invention plus commercialization makes up innovation. And it's really great. We would add in a couple things. What we would do is, first of all, we would say ideation is not enough, so it's got to be about opportunities along with invention. And then we would also say we would add in plus experimentation and then plus commercialization. And the reason why we focus on this experimentation part so much is we call it incubation, as do you, but we also know it's the missing link in companies. Incubation is the place where these opportunities get squeezed. You either don't do enough work from a discovery point of view to get it going, or you're too anxious to get it into commercialization that you don't give it the time it's required to incubate and reduce uncertainty to get it ready for moving into the prime time or into product development. So what we're saying from an innovation point of view here is, as I mentioned earlier, we really think about innovation as a discipline. And it's a lot more than invention. It's a lot more than creativity. Now, creativity and innovative thinking, going back to the roller coaster, we want everybody to be creative, and we want everybody to be innovative in their thinking. But do we really want everybody doing innovation? And that is really the question. So where, from the research and from our experiences, where we really came to sort of this major aha from an innovation point of view was around uncertainty. What we figured out, and this didn't come to us just, in all of a sudden. It took us a bit of time to get there. We figured out that what we're really dealing with in the early stages of an innovation opportunity, when we're doing discovery and incubation work, is uncertainty. And what we've got to be able to do is reduce the uncertainty so that it can easily fit into a phase gate or stage gate kind of development process. And there are two uncertainties. So everybody focuses on technical and market issues. That they're always there. There were two uncertainties that showed up in the phase one of the research time and time again. And these were resource and organization uncertainties. And these were the ones that got in the way of success. It wasn't the technical issues. It wasn't the market issues. The teams were able to work that through. It was these resource and organization uncertainties. And resource being, do we have the right people, the right talent on the team? Do we have the right level of funding that's necessary? Do we have the right partners in place if we need them to fill our competency gaps? And on the organization side, it was really around this whole area of establishing and maintaining legitimacy within the organization. When something new comes up, it doesn't always easily fit. And because it doesn't easily fit, it doesn't have a lot of credibility. And so the whole area of getting the stakeholders aligned and the nature of the guidance process, how decisions get made, what are the metrics that need to go along with it, or the key performance indicators to make this successful. These were all of the areas that were getting in the way of success. And so we now think of uncertainty across a spectrum that includes the technical, market, resource, and organization issues. So what we've done is we've taken this and we've created our continuum. And we have the green world, which is over here on my left, your right, which is really much more the world of incremental innovation, something that we're fairly comfortable with mind you, in some consumer companies that we work with, they even find incremental innovation a stretch because they do a lot of more sustaining innovation just to kind of keep up. But where we really see the value from an innovation point of view in terms of where we've come from the model is how do we deal with this evolutionary and breakthrough area? And in your terms, the evolutionary would include your adjacent and disruptive areas, and then clearly breakthrough would be your radical realm. What we've seen here, if I could just kind of point here, is that in order to do this well, there has to be some kind of strategic intent. You have to know what you're aiming for. It's great to ask, put an innovation challenge forward, ask people to generate ideas, but they need to know what you're really looking for from an investment point of view. And when we were at Nortel, we did the request for proposals. We asked the employees to bring their ideas forward. We didn't get a lot of value. We had to do a lot of work to turn them into opportunities because we weren't really clear on what was our strategic intent. That was one of the things that was really missing. The other here is the timeline, obviously, is longer. And we also here talk about, we contrast the voice of the customer, which is obviously everybody talks about listening to the customers, and we're not saying that it's not a good practice to listen to our customers. But as we move further out from our core, it's not necessarily our existing customers that we want to listen to. And so that's why we talk about the market voice and opportunity recognition. And as we get even further out, it's the future or technology voice and opportunity recognition. And then down here, we talk about, the focus going from existing customers to adjacent markets and then on into new markets and customers. Here, phase gate process for product development works very well from an incremental innovation point of view. It's designed to deal with technical and market issues. The resource and organization issues are not well addressed there. And we know when we're dealing with these early strategic innovation opportunities that those uncertainties are going to be higher. And so you see a lot of times where these projects don't pass the gate. And they don't pass the gate because they just can't compare, because you're looking at apples and oranges. Or in Europe, because I know we have some Europeans there, we've got pears and apples because they don't use the orange analogy. So the idea here is that we have to get them ready. And we get them ready by using what we call the discovery, incubation, and acceleration model. And that then reduces the uncertainty to a point where it's fair game. We're comparing apples and apples. We're not competing on an unequal level. And then over here, one of the big issues is knowing how to transition. A lot of times, these groups get discovery and incubation going. Then when it comes time to move it into commercialization or into acceleration, it just kind of gets thrown over the fence, falls on the other side, nobody picks it up. Or they do pick it up, but they can only see their side, and they incrementalize it to force fit it into what they know. Okay, so what we're managing here from the model point of view is really looking across the innovation continuum and dealing with the uncertainty that we're dealing with. So this is low, medium, and behind the box is high. So as part of this, we also uncovered another thing, that it's very difficult in corporate culture to admit what we don't know. And yet, it's fundamental to our success when we need to reduce uncertainty, because uncertainty, by definition, is we don't know. And we have to admit what we don't know in order to set up the tests and our assumptions that are necessary to go out and reduce uncertainty as a result. So we find that this admitting what you don't know is a major obstacle to being able to move forward. The second is to bring some discipline to chaos. We've heard a lot about, well, innovation is really about serendipity, and you just kind of let it happen, and if it happens, then we'll find value. So wrong. It's a combination of creativity with some discipline to be able to move things together so that when you're working on an opportunity, you move forward, you make progress, you reduce your uncertainty, you use your learning, you go through iterative stages to be able to make that happen. So we're not talking about discipline to stifle innovation. We're talking about discipline to bring some order to the actual progress. third area is communicate, communicate, and communicate more. As I mentioned, I started off my career in marketing, and back in those days, it was a retail world, and it was like called location, location, and location. So I kind of took that one, and I said, all right, what would be comparable in this world? And it's all about communication. When we sit in a room and we talk about innovation, on a high level, everybody shares that common language. When you start to get into the details, you'd be surprised about what people really think about innovation. So what we say is you cannot over-communicate. The more you communicate, the easier it is to get stakeholders aligned, get that common language going, and be able to build that shared mindset about what we're really accomplishing as a company together. And then finally, if you don't focus on these, what we have seen is you risk failing because of them. Okay, so this part of the uncertainty, if there's anything you can kind of take away from the ABCs, I personally think that it's admitting what you don't know. Being comfortable admitting what you don't know and asking questions rather than having answers. Now, what are your elephants? These resource and organization uncertainties, and I can speak to this because back in the era that I was at Nortel, I just thought these people were stupid. They didn't get it, or they were out to sabotage what we were doing, or they were playing political games, or, I could kind of go on and on and on because we were really trying, we thought, build value, and we had a lot of opposition along the way. And now, I wish, the benefit of hindsight, I wish I had known what I know now, and what I know now is that these are these resource and organization issues that we did not manage well. We did not address. We did not know how to address them. And those become the elephants in the room. It's the words that are not said, unstated, that actually get in the way of us being successful. And so I encourage you to think about what are your elephants when you're in your next innovation meeting. And make sure you raise them, get them out on the table. So now let's talk a little bit about culture and collaboration. So I started to get into a little bit of this, about what's going on in the culture and why do we see this kind of friction among the various cultures that operate. And what we have here, up here, the conflicts, we need entrepreneurial systems for learning, cultivating these opportunities, and making the kind of progress that's necessary. I noticed in your slides you have think like an entrepreneur, and think like a project manager. So we need this to be able to move forward. Yet it runs contrary to efficient systems that are in place for operational excellence and customer intimacy. And in a company, you need both. It's not one is better than the other. It's just a question of how do we balance it and how do we make them exist. And why does it happen? It's because when we're in a leadership role, a lot of the people that are in leadership role come up through the operational ranks. They haven't had a lot of experience with innovation. And they understand that they have to deal with the existing strategy in the culture. They want to focus on the existing business model. They want to meet customers' expectations. And we have processes, infrastructure, timing considerations that are all very relevant for running the core business today. But what happens is that if that culture is so dominant that it kills out the innovation culture, then these opportunities become incrementalized because they get force-fitted into what we know versus having the opportunity to thrive on the basis of what we don't know yet. And here we have another one. I know, Calvin, you've seen this, and I think, Mary, you might have seen it as well, right? I'm sure a few of you. This is, by the way, this is the one that got us to discover Tom in the first place. So here, you got our latest innovation is a goose that lays eggs of solid gold. And you've got, obviously, the scientist and the invention on the one hand. And over here, you have the suits, and note one has an axe. And that's a distraction from our core, and we have no budget for goose-related expenses. And then on that note, we'll need the feathers and liver for another project. Sound familiar? So it happens all the time. So what we're really saying about culture now is that they need to coexist. One serves today, the other serves tomorrow. And any company that's going to be successful over the long run has to be focused not only on today, but also on tomorrow. And we've defined some of the characteristics here of what that looks like. So we've got the current strategy versus more the strategic intent of where we want to be. Got the operational excellence world versus more the cultivation. And the employee intimacy here. This comes directly from our learning in the venture capital world. In the innovation world, it's all about people with some process to help the learning. You have to have the right people in the right place at the right time. Very similar to a VC who will bet on the team versus, the better idea. And so we really look at the value of the people component, and that's why we call it the employee intimacy. And then here, risk profile, more risk averse here, uncertainty reduction and risk mitigation. So at the project level, we're trying to reduce uncertainty. At the overall business level, when we place investments in innovation, they're risky. We know that. Well, if we can reduce the uncertainty, therefore we reduce the risk as well from a business point of view. And then here, timing, shorter term, traditional metrics. Here, longer term, more of a portfolio approach because we know that not all of these investments are going to be successful. And if they are being successful, then you probably only have incremental innovation happening. Now, this is not easy. This is a dilemma. How do you do this? And most companies don't do it well. The pendulum swings back and forth. In fact, IBM, that we've studied a lot over the years, they did a really good job of reinventing themselves, bringing out their emerging business opportunities and all of that. But at one point in time, they decided that they wanted all of their leadership to be ambidextrous. And what happened is they swung from having a very strong core over to everybody focusing much more on emerging business opportunities, and they started losing sight of the core business and keeping their eye on the ball. And then they realized that it's about an organization. It's not about the individuals themselves. And so it has to be managed from an organizational point of view. And here, we want one part thinking about how to sustain the current development trajectory. We want another, much smaller part, by the way. It is not about a lot of people. It's about a focused group of people innovating for new growth. And that's the balance between the short-term profits and then the long-term growth. So that's what we think of as the ambidextrous organization. We think of it at the organizational level, not at the individual level. Now, there are people that can do both. I've seen them. But there's very few people that are good in both worlds. And that's okay. For example, I obviously err on the innovation side. Do not put me in an operational role because I would not do well. I know that. First of all, I wouldn't find it to my liking. And secondly, I probably don't even have the right kind of experience to do it well. Okay? Now, here are the building blocks and the roadmap that we've created to get us from identifying an opportunity, conceptualizing it, taking it through experimentation, and getting it to a point where we're ready for development and the commercialization or the acceleration that's required. So I have another one to share with you. This one is here. I want to go in a new direction. So bring in the consultant to help you. And here, as you see, it says, sound interesting, but how do we get there? And the consultant says, it's obvious. You simply shift the paradigm with disruptive innovation. Okay? So you don't get any clues as to how to make it happen. A lot of times, I don't know if you ever saw, I think it was the IBM commercial, where they made a recommendation, and then they said, okay, can we make it happen? And the two consultants look at each other and like, I don't know what to do. So we're really thinking about a management model here for innovation. Now, we have on the top here these uncertainties that I've gone through. We also have the challenges that companies go through. And this came from the first phase of the research. First, it's capturing the opportunities. Then it's about living with chaos. And that's our term for project management. We want innovation to be chaotic, but we want to bring some order, some discipline to it along the way. Then, how do you do market learning when markets are either unfamiliar to you or they don't exist at all? How do you build a business model that isn't necessarily the one that you have today for your core business? And that might stretch you into new areas with partners, et cetera. The resource acquisition. In the world of innovation, we don't have standard budgets on an annual basis. We acquire resources wherever we can to make it work. And that's why we talk about resource acquisition. So how can you get good at doing that? The transition management challenge, I alluded to it earlier, getting from incubation to acceleration. And then finally, harnessing sort of the power of the individual. Now, when we first started the research, everybody thought, and this was done with the Industrial Research Institute, over 200 to 300 companies were involved at any point in time. They helped us define what radical innovation was, and then we studied them to figure out what worked and what didn't work. And everyone going into the research in 1995 said that the most daunting challenge would be capturing ideas and getting them into opportunities. But that wasn't the most daunting challenge. The most daunting challenge was transition management. Most companies can get these going, but they struggle to get them to a point where the uncertainty is reduced enough where it can continue on into product development. And that's why, as I mentioned earlier, we think of incubation as the missing link. So here are the building blocks. So we have this discovery, which is really about scoping the opportunity. And here, what's really important is planting a business vision of what could be. When we're looking at these opportunities, they're most often a culmination of ideas that form the opportunity. And that also means that there's a number of application possibilities associated with them as well. So we need to, because we have higher uncertainty and therefore higher risk, we need to define a number of application possibilities because many will fail. And as part of that, planning the business vision helps us to look at these as bigger opportunities, helps us define that. The second part is then, once we know what we're dealing with, incubation to reduce uncertainty. And this is where we pivot with experimentation. So sometimes we'll stay the course. Sometimes we will redirect. Sometimes we'll stop entirely based on what we learn. And we have what we call the learning plan or learning loops that help teams to progress through each of these iterations. And what we do is we get from one learning loop to the next learning loop, and whatever we've done in one learning loop forms the basis of what we need to learn next. So it's not like we know the end game yet. We just know what we need to do to get from one loop to the next loop. And eventually we get to the end game. And then finally here, we have acceleration, or the business growth part, which is really propelling it forward and ramping up, building the infrastructure, putting in place all the development requirements, et cetera, to make it happen. Now, when we think of discovery, the whole focus is on conceptualization of what it could be. And that involves getting ideas to opportunities, and it also involves creating this business vision. When we think of incubation, we think about experimentation, and we have two mantras that we use. Learning per dollar spent. What learning per dollar spent means is, how do I spend the least to learn the most? So it's really a factor of learning with a minimum amount of spending along the way. And I know you do prototyping and all of that, and so that's very much an important part of it. But we also see companies that do prototypes and say they have to spend 300,000 euros or $300,000 to do a prototype. And when we're coaching teams, we say, I don't think so. How can you do it for 25 or 50,000 or even less, depending on what you're dealing with? Oh, good. Okay, good to hear. The second mantra is, what is good enough? This is not about getting it right or making it perfect. This is about learning. So what is good enough for us to learn to get to the next learning loop? And often, this good enough part people really struggle with. In discovery, they do this analysis paralysis where they got to have all the answers, so they can't even get out of discovery to get into incubation. And then they get into incubation, and they're still trying to get all the answers, and they're not focusing on what is good enough. Okay, so incubation is the time to make sure we test our hypotheses, make sure our assumptions are clear, and convert them into knowledge, and therefore reduce uncertainty, and not only technical and market uncertainty, but also our resource and organization uncertainty. And then finally, acceleration is really about commercialization. And I'm sure you've heard about the bowling alley and crossing the chasm. And in acceleration, it's really about picking the first bowling pin and then realizing the vision, the business vision over time. So what's the first one? How is that family of products or services or solutions going to play out over time in order for me to realize that business vision that we created back in discovery that's likely changed a lot, but at least we had something that we were aiming for. So when we think about this, we think about it as a system that needs to be orchestrated. And when we think about orchestration, it's the orchestration of interfaces and it's the orchestration of the transition points to make sure that it's smooth, that nothing falls through cracks, and that we get the right type of support and organizational alignment as we're moving along. And so here we've got sort of the summary up here of what goes into the technical, market, resource, and organization areas across discovery, incubation, acceleration. And then we have sort of the system working together with the emphasis on incubation being very important to be done well. And as I mentioned earlier, a lot of companies, they do it or they don't do it at all, but they don't, most companies don't do it enough. They get impatient. They want to get to results too quickly. And then as a result of that, they squash the potential. So when we think of the system, and I won't go through this today, but I just wanted to put this in for completeness. We have elements that we've defined that are required to work through. Now, these elements don't all have to happen on day one, but they do need to be addressed over time. You know, such as, for example, getting a clear mission and scope of what this is all about. Or, for example, having the right process at the right time and the right tools at the right time to be able to move things forward, having the right kind of metrics, making sure decisions are made in the proper way, et cetera. When we think about our roadmap, we think about all of these elements that need to be addressed. We also think about the role of leadership. And a lot of times, leadership gets involved too much in the details, not enough in what it really counts. And the two areas where we see that are fundamental is charting the course, setting strategy, getting involved in the dialogue about where are we going and why is innovation important to us. And I know you've done a lot of that in EMC because I've seen it in the slides that Calvin and Mary shared, but I've also seen it in your website and I've seen it in other discussions as well. The other is helping the environment, focusing on the culture change, making sure that that operational excellence culture doesn't eradicate the innovation culture. And when we go back to these resource and organization uncertainties, it's only senior leadership that can remove those barriers and open the doors, because those are the ones that are handled at that level in the organization. Now, here's another one. Of course, everybody says, yes, but there's risk in trying a new course. But if you notice, they're on a course where they're already going to hit the iceberg. And she's the only one that's pointing at the iceberg, and they're all saying, yeah, well, we don't want to do anything. So how do we get there? It doesn't, as I mentioned, it doesn't happen overnight. It's really about building a capability over time. There has to be a call to action. There has to be a recognition, which you clearly have, that innovation is important. And there has to be an initiation point. That normally takes a couple of years to unfold. Then you reevaluate where you are, you figure out what works and doesn't work within the context of your culture, your strategy, your innovation ambitions, and all of the other requirements that go into running a healthy company. And then you figure out what do you need to do to make changes in order to evolve it, get it to the next level. And then ultimately, over time, it's about how do we sustain this capability. Now, we'll back up a number of years. When we were thinking about at Nortel or when RPI was doing its research, sustaining for us was this full capability that stayed in place forever. That's not the way it works. and that's not the way it should work. It's really about organizational capacity. And you want to make sure that you never completely shut down your innovation capability, because you're going to have to change your capacity depending on the financial situation, external factors, all kinds of other variables. But you don't, just as much as you wouldn't fire all your engineers or get rid of your engineering department or get rid of your manufacturing or marketing department, you shouldn't get rid of all your innovation people either. And in the past, that's what companies did. They just say, oh, can't do this anymore, can't afford it, we'll get rid of it. And then a few years later, they say, oh, we really need this, but all the talent's gone, we've lost it. So now we start fresh again. We have to relearn everything, and then we get to this 2 to 3 year timeline, and then people start to say, where are the results? And then it gets impatient again, and other factors happen, and it gets shut down again, and then we just go through this vicious cycle. So what we mean by sustaining now is that the capacity will change depending on internal and external drivers. But you should not get rid of innovation entirely. You have to keep it alive. Now, in charting the course, we think of our roadmap at 3 levels. One is at the strategic level in terms of what needs to be done. And we've covered the strategic or innovation intent and the field, talked about the culture part and managing education and managing expectations, and the education that goes along with it. We also have the portfolio management part with the right people and making sure that we pace this appropriately. We get the right types of activities in the pipeline. We have a healthy portfolio over time. Doesn't need to be a big one. We need to know what it is. Some companies, they have maybe 2 or 3 of these going on a year, such as some of the work that is going. But they're very clear what the objectives are. They know what their cadence is. They know how much they want to bring forward over time. And then down here, at this level, we're really focusing on learning. And what do we need to do to make progress to reduce these uncertainties and get through the milestones that are necessary? And what we did then is we also built out programs and tools to help in each of those areas so that teams can continue to do the learning and have the right kind of infrastructure or support and strategy so that it's a continuous capability rather than piece parts or just individual projects here and there. And when we look at innovation maturity levels, we look at kind of where does a company want to be. And down here on the one, it's in ignorance or denial. Some companies don't even recognize that innovation is important for them. Here you kind of get into awareness by a few. 3, processes are an add-on, and that's where most companies are. They have processes for innovation, and they know that they need to do it. But when you start getting into a more integrated approach and when it becomes part of the mindset, those are the companies that are becoming very successful in terms of being able to continue to grow and also reinvent themselves. So, I guess the question is and I know we're going to go to questions, maybe we'll come back. Where are you today and where do you aspire to be? Are you happy where you are, or do you want to get further, and those kinds of questions. So the conditions for success, as far as we can see, based on our experiences, is building innovation as a sustainable capability. And it has to be clear up front, what's the game? If I were ever to go back into a company again, I have a rule of 5 that I would use. My rule of 5 is that you need at least 5 senior people engaged and committed. And in our industry at the time, I would say, I would want $50 million of investment over 5 years. I would want a runway of 5 years. And that's my rule of 5 for moving forward. Now, obviously, in the end, this is about a mindset and a discipline and bringing it together. Everyone, in the room and on the WebEx, you all are hired by EMC because you have IQ. What makes us successful in innovation is EQ. Because you go back to these resource and organization uncertainties, it's all about people. So we have to have a very high level of emotional intelligence to be able to maneuver through all of the requirements to orchestrate this. And so that's when we think about the mindset. It's the combination of our intelligence with our emotional capability on top of that, plus being able then to also deal with discovery and incubation. And, you know, the discipline here, we actually, when we're putting this together, I was thinking this is maybe a little too chaotic for what we wanted to represent. But there are arrows coming and going and all of that. So the discipline is a light touch, not a heavy touch. But it's necessary, as I mentioned earlier, to make progress. So in the end, it is about finding our own little rainbows along the way. And I guess that's also a beach. I just actually was on vacation and I came from the beach, so it kind of resonated. So I want to thank you all, and I know we're going to questions, so thank you very much.
Much for that, really appreciate it. So yeah, let's take some time for questions. I want to start off with the WebEx because I know we've got quite a large number of folks there. Thanks to everyone for joining around the globe. And yeah, absolutely. And so if you haven't already, I know we've already got a couple of questions in the WebEx, but if you are joining via WebEx, in the chat window, you want to actually send to everyone. So there's a little drop down there. You click on everyone, and then just go ahead and add your question. And what I'll do is just read some out to you, and then let you voice them over, if that makes sense.
Great.
So the first question that came in about halfway through, which is a great question. You addressed parts of it, but I think we can dig a little deeper, is from Paul Zonfrillo, who's one of my favorite innovators. We got so many of them within the company, but he's done particularly well with a couple of his ideas. So he says, the risk and investment you speak of are not only in real business dollars, but in political capital. Any tips on how to convince those whose success is rooted in operational excellence to risk some of that political capital?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
What I did not mention is the third phase of the research that RPI is engaged in right now is all about the importance of people and institutionalizing innovations for people, and they're studying a lot of that. You know, that's not an easy answer because in the end, we talk about doing the best we can to get people on board. And we're not always going to be able to get everyone on board. So yes, we can convince them by the fact that we're working as one company and what you're doing today is important and what we're doing for tomorrow is equally important, and you can have that kind of conversation. But in the end, there are certain people that will not risk their political capital because they're too grounded in operational excellence. And what we say there is you try to neutralize them as much as possible. And how do you neutralize them? You build other supporters that can surround them and, flank them basically so that they're not obstructive, but they're not necessarily going to be supportive either. And, this is, we have tools where you do stakeholder assessments and you talk about what kind of messages. You need to understand who your stakeholders are. You need to understand what their motivations are. And you need to do all of that research, and you need to do it very well. But in the end, there are certain people that just cannot get out of that world of operational excellence. So if at least you can get them to say, okay, fine, what you're doing is all right, but don't ask me to be a part of it, then that's good.
You're right, so there are workarounds.
Yeah, well, there are some mavericks, yeah. Actually, in one company, we saw mutiny.
Oh, no. We're not proposing mutiny today, believe me. Yeah. We're not proposing mutiny. Fair. Thank you for that answer. So we'll take one more via the WebEx, and then we'll switch to the room. And Satish, I do recognize your question. We're going to come back to that. Please send me an email or send an email to innovation@emc.com. That's more of an internal conversation, and we want to leverage Joanne's time in the right way. But a great question from Steve Graham. What are some examples of companies at levels 4 and 5 in the maturity model? So you showed, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. John Deere is up in the 4-5 level. IBM has been up in the 4-5 level. Not sure lately because it kind of dropped a little bit in our estimation. Because I know it's good for you guys. Another one is Corning. Corning has been up there, and the reason being is that they almost lost their shirts, as you probably well know, during the with fiber optics. And they were able to reinvent themselves into Gorilla Glass and all kinds of other things. And I've been reading lately, because we haven't been working with them as closely, I've been reading lately that they're starting to move on to other basis of their core competence in glass into other areas as well. So those are the kind of companies we would put up there. Lego has gone up there as well. Lego suffered a lot. And then they reinvented themselves, and they've been doing very well recently. I run into Lego. I actually teach at the Danish Technical University, so we actually run into a number of Danish companies. And Lego, I saw them 5 years ago. They were really doing poorly, and now they're doing exceptionally well. So even when you get to the 4s and 5s, you don't always stay there. But those are, I think, examples of some companies that have been there. But I wouldn't say that anyone's a perfect five at this point in time in the sort of the journey related to innovation and where we've been going.
I'll bring the mic around. Harrison Roberts, please.
When it comes to competency and innovation, do you see companies choosing either product innovation or process innovation? So companies like Dell really excel at sort of the process innovation, coming up with better ways to wring out costs from manufacturing. Do you see that it's still part of the innovation hub, or is that sort of a separate area?
No, actually, that's a great question. And what we see is it depends on the industry the companies are in. But number of companies, for them, innovation is product, process, services, all kinds of different types of innovation. Even we've been working with Westinghouse, and they're doing organizational reinvention using innovation to do that. So they've completely redone their whole R&D area. They're using discovery and incubation. In fact, Kate Jackson, who's the CTO, said if you don't have a capability to do that, you're just investing in endless science projects. So they're really trying to get out of that science mindset and using innovation to do so. So we're seeing it in a lot of different areas. We also work with a company in Denmark called Grundfos, and they have a lot of product innovation. They have some solutions and a little bit of service innovation, but they also have process innovation that's happening on their manufacturing side. So depending on the industry and the company, some might choose one domain, but we see a lot that's spread across, different forms of innovation, different types.
Oh, we got one over here.
Are you able to talk about any companies like EMC, high-tech companies where you have gotten involved, and the kinds of things you've been able to do with them, and what some of the results have been?
Yeah, well, of course, working with Nortel was pretty close. We've also done some work with IBM, and we've also written a number of cases. Because I guess to clarify, we kind of go between the research and the consulting world. So some of our experience is on the research side, and some of it's on the consulting side. And some of it, quite frankly, is in between, because we don't really do true consulting. Because we do a lot more training, coaching, those kinds of things. So we've worked with, my experiences in Nortel, of course. We've worked with IBM. We've worked with a few of the Danish companies that are in more the high-tech area as well. What I find in the technology companies is that the technology is the source of innovation in many cases, and then you build the opportunity out around it. And you have this question about sort of the market pull and technology push. And in the high-tech sector, we see a lot of technology push. And there's a lot of criticism of that because everybody's saying there should be market pull. But what we're saying is you need the two together. And so a lot of the work we've done in the high-tech area is very technology intensive. And it's about putting the business wrap around the technology so that we can reduce the uncertainty and then get it to a viable product or service or solution, whatever sort of you're aiming for at that point in time. So that's kind of the experiences that we've had. So I've had the personal experience, we've got the research, and we've worked with companies. Unfortunately, I can't get into too many details, but I think that helps. Okay.
5 more minutes in Q&A, if you don't mind.
Okay.
We'll switch back to the WebEx. Great question from Vladimir. I'm guessing it's Vladimir Suvorov, although he doesn't identify himself. But great question, Vlad. How do you persuade a business unit that's already had its own strategic plan in place, call it their existing roadmap, right, for X or Y number of months, to add some innovation into their plan, right? How do you kind of inject innovations that perhaps the innovator or even a group of stakeholders think are highly relevant, and how do you kind of convince them and say, this is something that we need to include in the next product release or get on your roadmap?
Okay. This is actually another great question, and this goes back to this whole area of transition management. What we're finding is that the conversations with the business units happen too late. If they happen earlier, then the level of engagement is more of an us and us rather than an us and them type of conversation. And so we've taken transition management and really built out a whole capability or process around it, which starts in sort of the early stages of incubation where you start having dialogue. You get the right stakeholders engaged as you move things along. And that way you're ready to be able to put things on the roadmap because they're a part of it and they're actually engaged in helping to move it forward. And then they actually, one company, Moen in fact, has negotiated with their business units where they have a slot on the roadmap, but they don't know what it's going to be. They just know that they have a slot there. And then they work together, and when it gets closer to the end of incubation, then they pick the one that they're going to put onto the product roadmap. But that's because they've had a dialogue much earlier, and they've used transition management in a very guided process, which was very much about building alignment and getting the engagement of those in the business unit.
Because a number of the folks on the WebEx and certainly in the room are involved in the innovation roadmap process at EMC. An important caveat to add here. I know everyone's they're laughing because I have a little plug here, but this is important for the innovators, especially on the line. We're going to do something a little different this year. So after what Joanne just said and talks with her and others previously, you know, sometimes we have been a bit too delinquent in terms of approaching the PMs because the product managers, partially because sometimes it's a center of excellence or a cross-cutting organization that's actually facilitating the incubation. Then you need to kind of sell that back to the business unit on the back end. Yeah. So approaching April, for folks on the line who are curious, now that you have your business cases and your proof of concept definition documents completed, we're going to have a very important meeting in April that's going to be with your existing sponsors and the executives, which will be kind of a traditional go, no-go decision. But we're also going to be mapping in the product managers that could be the relevant kind of implementation path. So whereas in the past we may not have communicated with them until further on in the process, we want to do that early this year. So to that point, I think Joanne makes a phenomenal thing to bring up here. And Ed, I think you had a question too.
Joanne, you talked a lot about the challenges of innovation internally within a company. At EMC, we like to think we're very in touch with our customers. Have you seen a lot of companies that you've been working with, working from an open innovation perspective and doing some reverse engineering types of innovation? I don't know if you could comment on some of the best practices you've seen around that.
Yeah, well, first of all, I would never say we're at best practice yet in innovation. I would say we're in sort of emerging leading edge type of practices. But best practices, once you get to best practices, you're kind of looking in the rearview mirror because It's been defined. What we see is in our world, a lot of it is around partnerships. And yes, there's a lot of having sort of a capability, say, within an EMC and a gap, and then bringing in a partner in order to be able to move it forward. And so a lot of it is about filling the competency gaps and working together to build out a capability. So we call them strategic partnerships. We actually spend a lot of time with companies helping them, and what we're finding is that just as much as you need to build that common language and mindset inside the company, if you're working with a customer or a partner and in a collaborative open innovation environment, they also have to be a part of it. So most of the companies that we work with, they're partners. They do their learning loops together. They work through their uncertainties together. They define what has to be done. So they're very much a part of moving it forward. And that didn't happen initially. It started happening over time when they realized how important it was to get everybody on the same page. And at first they were afraid to have too open a dialogue with their partners. But then they realized that if they didn't have an open dialogue, they were going to have an inferior outcome. And so that's why they started to open it up. So they're bringing in technology and a lot of times putting it in together with what they already have.
I just see a lot of times when you talked about recognizing what you don't know, a lot of times being able to collaborate with a partner or a customer, they bring something to the table in that area. And also, I would think it would help you manage risk during the process as well. Right,
exactly. And by following the methodology of uncertainty reduction, it helps everybody to move forward together rather than getting into opposing views of how things should be done.
Yeah, so I think we have time for just one more question. We'll default over to Joe here. But for the additional questions on the WebEx, I do apologize we weren't able to address all of them. This will be a continuing conversation with Joanne, and we'll see what we can do to answer some of your questions offline as well, okay?
As a Canadian, I was just wondering if you could comment on what happened with RIM. RIM, 3 years ago, great product, top of the market. What happened? How did they fall, and what role did lack of innovation play in that?
And just to piggyback on that, we can get a bonus answer to a different question on the WebEx. Someone else asked the same thing about Microsoft and Nokia, right? What are some of the the overall, and I know RIM is the focus, but what are some of the structures that lead to ultimate demise or slowdown, right?
Okay, so Nokia I studied more, so I'll come back to that. But for RIM, and these are my personal thoughts because I haven't done a lot of research there. From what I can see, and I actually had shares in RIM as well, so so when I say personal research, there was some personal research. I think they got into a culture of complacency. I think they thought that what they had was so inventive, and especially their whole security capability, that they would just be able to continue doing what they were doing. And I don't think they really embraced the open innovation model in a big way. I think their doors were too closed, and I think they got too insular, and it was too late by the time they recognized that they had missed out. And they, again, they were a company where the technology got them to where they needed to be, but then the world has changed so much, and they just didn't keep ahead with the business model changes and with what was actually going on in some of the other domains where everything was opening up. And they didn't have a good business model in the end. Now, Nokia, on the other hand, again, what I seen and what we studied is that they also got fairly complacent in terms of what was going on. And we did work with them maybe 6-7 years ago, and that was when they started to cut their innovation part. And when they were cutting innovation, it was kind of like, for us, an early warning signal of what was to come, and actually ended up unfolding. Now, Microsoft, we never have thought of as innovative. In fact, back in the Nortel days, we had the option of partnering with Microsoft, and nobody wanted to, and we weren't alone. Nobody in the industry wanted to work with Microsoft. And so, I would not put them on, I would put them on the follower, maybe the fast follower side of things, but I certainly wouldn't put them on the innovative side of things. So anyway, my opinion and a little bit of research there, but for what it's worth.
482, which Mary Henderson will hand over to you.
Oh, no. Yeah. Oh.